Sounds good.
I did it just so we don't forget.
Let me just nudge Mark. He said he's coming.
Which Mark? We got a few Marks here.
Mark from Megapon.
There's 3 Marks here.
Okay.
Mark is here. I think that he is maybe muted or something's up with the sound.
I was just herding my children away, so I apologize.
Oh, hey, Mark. Cool. Awesome. Right. Let me nudge
Cool.
Trevor. I'm gonna give Trevor a nudge.
Yeah. He might be running late. I mean, I'm sure if he's in Korea right now, Korea Blockchain Week, I'm sure he's probably talking to lots of people and might be just busy.
Yeah, I mean, I can get started first, anyways.
Yeah,
The
why don't we
beginning
do
bit.
that? Do you have the ability to share your screen?
Yeah.
Cool.
Let me try. Can you see?
Yep.
Cool. All right. Shall I start?
Yeah, go ahead. We'll just, when Trevor comes, he comes.
Cool. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for coming to today's session. Really appreciate everybody's time. And we are really lucky today to have people with really great knowledge from technical side, from NFT side, from even the DAOs. So I hope today's session will be really productive for everyone and for the whole Stacks ecosystem, because I think it's a big unlock if we can get this field push even forward. So yeah, today's is SIP Communicable number 8, 12th August, Friday. So just to sort of set the scene a little bit, before we go into the details of today's topic of discussion, this call is all about Stacks improvement proposal. And here we talked about, we give the community a transparent update of where any SIP related stuff. And if you have any SIP related stuff, such as an NFT token standard, any other communication method, or anything SIP related, whether it's governance or information, here is a place where you can share your ideas and discuss with the SIP, whole of SIP community. And we are really lucky to have Jude here every week almost. So yeah, so it's a great place to get feedback. You can collaborate with people, gauge an interest, see whether this is something that community want or need. So you can champion for your SIP that's currently in progress. So I'll just pull back a little bit because some people might be new here who might not have been on this call. So SIP stands for Stacks Improvement Proposal, and it's essentially just a document that lives on GitHub that describes all the spec regarding a token standard, consensus, even the governance process. SIP 000 is on there. So SIP 12 was the one that we passed last November, so it has all the details. Yeah, that's the SIP document. And here we discuss the SIP process a little bit. So as you can see, basically there's a whole process in place that goes from the idea phase, from even brainstorming phase. We can go from brainstorm to recommended for comments to an actual draft and get reviewed by editors and reviewed by the CAPS consideration advisory boards, and then get reviewed by the steering committee. And then it gets activated if all the criteria are met. And then gets voted on eventually by the whole community, even by OKCoin, they need to vote. So that's what we went through last year. So that's the sort of quick overview of the SIP process. So Yeah, I'm going to give a very quick update of where things are currently in the pipeline. SIP 13, that's a fungible, semi-fungible token standard by Marvin. That's ready to be reviewed, and we'll hopefully activate CAP, technical CAP, to review that. And we have SIP 16, 18, and 19, all in ready to be activated process, basically. It's quite later stage of the process. So they just need to make sure the criteria are met. And I've noticed that SIP 16 actually has a criteria of needs to be implemented by 10 contracts, or the 10 NFT 10 contract needs to have this spec. So and it is going on block. It needs to be done by block 750,000 Bitcoin block. So that's the criteria. So it's basically under a week that we've got to make sure that the criteria is met. So yeah, I'm discussing with trying to help Marvin, Fridger, to push that through. Yeah, so that's the sort of the later stage SIPs. And here we have earlier stage SIP regarding identity stuff, which Fridger is working on. Some GitHub issue that we have on GitHub. So yeah, everything sort of lives on GitHub. And we're trying to open that sort of process maybe via skin on a website so they can be easier accessed by the public. So yeah, some earlier stage discussion on SIP stuff. The one we're going to be talking about today is the Bitcoin derivation path, which hopefully will unlock more NFT usage and DAOs and DeFi for Bitcoin addresses, even more seamlessly. And we've talked about the miner centralizations on this call. How do we decentralize the miners? How do we get how do we reduce the barriers to entry for the small and medium potential miners coming in, so that this network can be even greatly decentralized? So here we do focus very much about getting people participated, making the decision process as decentralized as possible. It's an ongoing improvement. Yeah, so yeah, just a quick sort of summary of what we talked about in the past. A mining 2.1 upgrade, Taproot, the consideration advisory boards, all parts of the governance and the core stacks tech stuff. So it's a really sort of important type of sessions and calls here. So I hope everybody from the community and builders can tune in to this kind of calls, because everything really matters. Like this talks here really matters, has really big impact for everyone. Yeah, so just it's why should you care about it? Because it's a process. We need to have a really robust process. It affects all stakeholders most of the time. We need to vet those SIP through really thoroughly so that it doesn't have a negative side effect after we've implemented. So we really want to make sure those side effects are spotted, vetted out prior via testing, via people reviewing it. And really important to have your community's voice heard throughout this process. This process is not just the devs, it's about the builders, about the users, it's about the wallet providers, or maybe the people who invested in stacks. So everybody should take part in this process. We really want to be as decentralized as Bitcoin as possible. At least that's my sort of hope. Anyways, so we are not like, we don't end up like Luna, like Solana, that all the decision power is so centralized. Yeah. Yeah, so we'll quickly get into today's discussion. And I have my co-host with me, Jason. He's going to help me lead this talk. And we're going to be talking about derivation path and how to increase Bitcoiners participation, even say they are not a stacker, even they can just utilize the Bitcoin address that they have Bitcoin on and doing transaction on Bitcoin. So yeah, I'll pass it to Jason.
All right, thank you so much, and appreciate everybody coming out today. I see a lot of familiar faces out there in the names. And before we get started, I just wanted to intro some of the people that we'll have talking today and some of the people that will just be covering the different topics we're going to get into. And we're going to talk about how Bitcoiners can participate in stacks and some of the things that have been explored, as well as looking at what the next steps would be to actually create a standard or to do something big here. So before we get into it, we have Mark from Megapont. He's the founder at Megapont NFT, top stacks collection right now with cross-chain abilities. We've got Jude, the research scientist at Stacks Open Internet Foundation, one of the core blockchain engineers for Stacks. We have Ken, the founder and CEO at Secret Key Labs, who brings us the Xverse mobile wallet, and that has Bitcoin and Stacks built in. And then Trevor, the managing partner at Stacks Ventures, and very interested in unlocking Bitcoin's potential. A few other people I want to call out in the audience too. I saw that Jamil is here. He's the founder at Gamma, who on top of the excellent marketplace they have has provided minting through Bitcoin and Lightning. DeWalker, the CTO at Hero Systems, who build the Hero wallet extension and many of the ecosystem tools that we use in Stacks. And then we have Mark from Hero as well. He's the product lead up there, and he leads the user experience team. So very great group that we have with us. Appreciate you all coming out. And with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about what's possible between Bitcoin and Stacks today and how Bitcoiners can participate in NFTs, DeFi, DAOs, and more. That's really the goal here. You know, what if someone could participate with just Bitcoin? And with that in mind, I did want to cover just a real quick technical bit about derivation paths. So if we can go to the next slide. Hero, can we go to the next one? Thank you. All right, so really quick, this is kind of the topic that kicked everything off. So to finish out that conversation, a derivation path is basically how a wallet uses your private key to create usable addresses. There are standards like BIP44 and BIP49 that define how the address is created. And there's also standards like SLIP44 that define coin types. So each blockchain uses its own path. So it's a bit technical, but the main thing I wanted to show here is that there are two different ways to generate an address shown on the screen. On the left side, you can see what would be the derivation path for Bitcoin, which generates this address. And on the right side, you'd see the derivation path for Stacks, which generates a different address. The main thing that I wanted to illustrate here is both of these addresses are made with the same private key. So when we're talking about derivation paths, we're talking about how we get from that private key to an address and how to make that consistent across not only our experiences, but other wallet experiences too. This is how wallets know how to deal with your keys. We can go to the next one, Hero. So Stacks and Bitcoin addresses can be converted between each other, but there are some caveats. And a lot of this comes from the forum, so appreciate everybody participating there, but some quick challenges that we see. If the Stacks derivation path is used in one place, but a Bitcoin in another, you don't get the same address. A Stacks address can be converted into a SegWit address, but it requires a public key to go the other way. We do have a feature in Clarity called Principle of, but it's broken until 2.1. So there's a little extra work that has to be done for certain actions, depending on what you're trying to do. And while the leading number, like having the 3 in front, might say that it really just says it's a script. It doesn't tell you what kind of address. So a lot of times these numbers and the way the addresses are generated don't give us a clear way to know exactly what it is. Finally, there's hardware wallets and cold storage solutions, and they can be picky about which derivation paths they use. So all of this has to be kept in mind. One more slide, and then I'm almost done. So this is why you can't really know what an address is because of what it starts with. There's a few different areas there's a few different standards that create different types of Bitcoin addresses, and some of them can look exactly the same. So, you know, they're defined by their relevant proposal. Like in this case, we're talking Bitcoin. So there's Bitcoin improvement proposals that defines the addresses, and they are recognizable by the characters they start with. So now that we've kind of like dove into that overall and done a summary of everything, what I was curious from the group that we have here is do we still feel like this is something that needs to be addressed? Is this something that would still be helpful, or any other thoughts? And I thought maybe we could start with you, Ken, since you had the original issue that we brought up.
Yeah, sure. So I definitely think, we should address this issue. I think in the beginning when Stacks was designed, I think we wanted to have a more of a separate identity from Bitcoin, and we chose a different coin type and everything, different address and coding. But now that we're looking at more deeper integration with Bitcoin, and we're building smart contracts for Bitcoin, the different address formats are really kind of getting in the way of some of the applications, and it also causes confusion with users, because it looks to them like these are like two separate things, when in fact the two different addresses really encode for the same public key.
All right, I think that really describes it. So I know what we were talking about before with those standards, one of them that I mentioned was SLIP 44 that comes from Satoshi Labs. And it's basically a registry of all the different blockchains that are using a BIP 44 scheme, but they use a specific number recognized as their coin type. So when we were looking at the derivation pass earlier, that's where the 5757 comes from in the Stacks world. Now, with that in mind, with the fact we're building contracts on Bitcoin, I know there was a little bit of pushback, or at least some further thinking from you, Mark, from the Hero Wallet side. Did you have anything to add to those thoughts?
Yeah, I guess my question mainly is just the the user experience, UX goals here. What kind of use cases we have in mind? My sort of perception before is that we want to sort of collapse the experience into sort of one address per account, if you will, in a given wallet. So you don't have a sort of a separate one for Stacks versus Bitcoin. I'm not so clear that is our goal anymore. So I guess I'm trying to figure that out among the group. I think airdrops are part of this as far as what we want to enable, but I'm also not entirely clear. Is that the main thing we want to do? From a wallet provider point of view, I do want to look for sort of simplification, but without too much extra technical complexity that comes with it. So yeah, I'm sort of here to listen and hear what people's needs are for the most part.
Well, I think in that case, is there, if there's any specific comments toward derivation pass or anything else we want to add on that topic, I'd like to close it out and we can move on to talk about use cases, because I do think that'll help generate the conversation too. But I just want to give that a minute in case anything else.
So maybe the background about how that derivation path that we have for Stacks exists. The reason you have different derivation paths at all is because you generally want it to be the case that you don't use the same private key to sign transactions for two different blockchains. The derivation path itself is a mechanism for deriving a new private key from your master private key, and it's going to be different based on each derivation path. The risk of trying to use the same private key for two different use cases, like for two different blockchains, or even something more mundane like signing data and then signing a transaction, is that with some cleverness, it's more often than not possible to make a piece of data look like a transaction, or make a transaction that's valid in one blockchain look like a transaction that's valid in another. And if someone can do this, they can steal funds from you. They can trick you into signing something that you don't know the implications of what that signed data will actually do. You may not recognize it as a transaction when you sign it, but a different blockchain might. And that's a problem. Derivation paths solve this by making sure that you can't ever use that private key for any other context. And that's why hardware wallets are so adamant about enforcing that, because it really is about keeping your funds and your assets safe. But this, of course, kind of works against this goal that was, or this proposal really on the forum, that we try to find a way to convert between the Stacks addresses and Bitcoin addresses, because you're fundamentally dealing with addresses that correspond to two different private keys. They may share the same master private key, but the derivation paths are different in order to preserve this safety property.
I think that was a great context. I'll just chime in for a second. I think there's kind of maybe 2 points here. One is like the long-term goal, and then the other is like the short-term goal. And I think the long-term goal is like to make the UX as simple as possible for people coming from Bitcoin, and also a general like perception of stacks in terms of being built on top of Bitcoin and using Bitcoin is essentially like a kind of layer 2. And so like more longer term, I'm interested in, maybe Ken has better thoughts on like the other use cases in terms of the vision of being like the invisible smart contract layer for Bitcoin via stacks. But I think this conversation has started in one place and has gone through many different explorations. I think is really valuable. The original idea was sort of like to be able to use the same seed phrase in another wallet. And I think after getting feedback, we found that's not an ideal solution, especially if we saw, what happened with Phantom Wallet recently, and like sort of the exploit there where people use the same passphrase in another wallet that just was exchanging their private key over plain text, and they got a bunch of their funds drained. Seems to me like that's a clear evidence against that idea. But I don't know that the need is to be able to maintain the existing Bitcoin wallet that you have on a, if you have a Exodus or Samurai or Ledger, on Bitcoin, I don't know that you need to be able to plug that into stacks, at least in the short term right away. Maybe that's something that we aspire to do in the future. But I think the short term, in terms of the airdrop use case, the main thing would be to be able to transfer assets from a Bitcoin wallet to another Bitcoin wallet that is connected to stacks. So to be able to send somebody an NFT or a fungible token to their existing Bitcoin address, whenever somebody receives something that has a monetary value attached to it, like if I sent you, $20 on PayPal, it's a pretty strong incentive to sign up for something. And so just a simple idea to be able to at least sign a transaction through a web interface and using principle of to transfer that to a new address that you receive by signing up for Hero or Xverse Wallet, I think seems to me like the low-hanging fruit use case. And there's a sort of the evolution of where my thinking has gone with that led to a forum topic about just moving assets. And I think Jude gave some really tangible advice on how that can be possible with Stacks 2.1. So like right now with prior to Stacks 2.1, you need to do a pre-registration process, which I think is going to be a little bit of a headache. But as soon as we move to the 2.1 and we can have a web interface that maybe could be integrated into both wallets, where or it could even be probably integrated into NFT marketplaces and other things, where you can go and you can have your Bitcoin address, you can click a button that says, transfer this, take ownership or transfer this. I'm not sure what the exact call to action would be, but to allow you to generate a transaction that you can sign with your existing Bitcoin wallet that would actually move it to the new address that you get when you sign up for Hero or Xverse, I think would be the simplest and cleanest ability to execute that use case. That's kind of where my thinking is at. I'd love to hear if anyone else has thoughts on it.
Yeah, I think that's right in line with, coming into this next slide around the different use cases and ideas. And when I took everything that I saw and distilled it down, like these were really the main questions we were asking, which is exactly the point you made, Trevor. It's like, how can a Bitcoiner mint, own, send, and receive an asset using Bitcoin transactions? And an extension of that too, I know is coming from Chris Castig working on Console. He was saying, can Bitcoiners participate in a DAO simply by sending in Bitcoin? So similar idea, like we're trying to define how can somebody from the Bitcoin chain be able to interact with Stack smart contracts? And I think that's the perfect kind of thing that we could generalize into a SIP. I actually got Jude, when you told me the other day, you kind of put the light bulb on for me. It's like, if you just look at it as a Bitcoin RPC call, how can we define how these things communicate back and forth and kind of expand a little bit on what's out there today, which I'll get into a little bit later. But on that topic, so we have this idea of trying to do these things with Bitcoin. And I know we have a few people here who have been working towards that. And I didn't know if there were any comments that anybody wants to share on like what you're doing, what have you learned, what are you blocked on, just regarding trying to enable this world. Like, have we had any breakthroughs, anything to share?
Not so not look related to any breakthroughs, but I kind of just had a question about just like the general kind of like Bitcoin DAO concept, especially kind of based off of this kind of the topic of the discussion today on the Bitcoin derivation path. So it seems to me from everything I've read and from my understanding, right, like this kind of DAO use cases, like everyone's kind of focusing on the funding aspect of it, but kind of what would make it a DAO, right, is that then the Bitcoin can then be moved off the basis of votes. And so at least for this use case, it doesn't seem like, I don't know if I'm wrong somewhere or if anyone has like seen something else to the contrary, but it doesn't seem like this would really help to kind of further that use case, since then the Bitcoin can't really be moved on the basis of votes, or am I missing something?
I think in this use case, it was more like the Bitcoin representing a vote in the DAO, and the governance would still happen somewhat on the stack side. But the idea was to open up participation even as far as people on exchanges and on Coinbase, similar things like that. I don't know the exact details of it. I'd have to have him lay it out. But I know that was part of the vision that they were looking at and talking about on the forum.
Okay, yeah, cool, thank you.
Cool. So considering these use cases and ideas, does anybody else have any thoughts they want to share? And if not, I do have another slide where I wanted to talk about storing data and transactions, and I think it's going to bring us right into the same information. But I'll give a quick pause there.
On the,
generally.
do you want to go, Mark, or shall this Mark go? I don't mind. You can go first.
No, you go for it.
Okay, cool. Thank you. On the use cases, obviously we have an upcoming NFT mint on Ethereum actually, and it's a pretty centralized. It's vastly centralized process, and in order to facilitate some Bitcoin interaction with that mint, keep it in line with our home being on Stacks, we're supporting payment into that NFT mint through Lightning. And it's really just a completely centralized API that's then going to use an Oracle support with Chainlink to say that, okay, this centralized entity is saying that this person can now have this NFT upon conclusion of the experience. And it got me thinking to like, one, what kind of adoption we expect from individuals using Lightning to take part in that NFT experience, and the use case of where I see NFTs fitting in with Stacks in particular. I read through quite a lot of the discussion on the derivation path forum thread, and I think that being able to essentially airdrop an NFT and assign that with a Bitcoin address is the most common use case that I see, i.e., hey, we know of this Bitcoin address and I know this Bitcoiner, and perhaps I want to mint him an NFT, him or her an NFT, and then they can come to Stacks at a later date and now move that asset. And every time I think about that use case and any derivation of that use case, I think to myself that regardless, there's going to need to be some interaction on the Stacks chain for them to fully enable the use cases of that NFT, or I guess enjoy what an NFT encompasses, right? Whether that's like token gated communities or it's an asset that can be sold on a marketplace. And I think the idea of moving NFTs with Bitcoin transactions is certainly a use case that I can see some validity in. But for now, just having that standardized derivation path is probably enough for the vast majority of kind of Bitcoiners that I talk to, at least, who aren't really maxis and are like, it would be cool to have an NFT. Maybe one day I want to do something with it, but just knowing that it's being sent to me. And I also, you'll see me in Megapoint talk about this as well. The Web3 community as a whole is very different from the sort of the monetary community in Bitcoin. The Web3 community, for the most part, is okay to throw away some privacy. They're okay to adopt some centralization. And what that means from sort of the Stacks derivation path, I think, is having some of this take place at the wallet level is also something that I think a lot of participants in NFTs would probably be willing to entertain, right? If it doesn't happen necessarily on the blockchain, but it happens at the wallets. The downside of that having implications on hardware, again, though, is something to keep in mind. a lot of people want to keep their NFTs regardless of what chain they're on a ledger or any other hardware, because they can be worth quite a bit of money to some of the individuals. So that's my thought on the NFT use case in particular. I think the DAO one is interesting. Chris obviously had some interesting points there as well around just having this Bitcoin treasury managed by like a Stacks DAO, as opposed to using the Bitcoin as governance. You just use it as like a treasury, but then you get into that situation where if you can't move it the other way, it's a bit tricky. So that's all I wanted to say. I'll pass the floor over to Mark now.
Yeah, just very general thought. I'm kind of wondering, like, how much of the paradigm do we want to build towards is a Bitcoiner knows about Stacks and knows how to send Bitcoin to certain addresses, certain amounts to trigger Stacks-based things, but they don't want to install a Stacks-enabled wallet. Like that's too much of a step for them. They want to design for that. Versus they learn about they can do things with Stacks via Bitcoin, but they will install and set up a Stacks empowered wallet, because I think that's sort of a big sort of decision for us. If we can bring people into a Stacks powered wallet experience, there's a lot more options, of course, that we can do with their Bitcoin or with Stacks or what have you. If we're saying that's too much of a step for these use cases, these three or other ones, I think we're sort of dealing with other constraints, right? So I'm curious if we have some thoughts on that.
I'm not sure that that's much of a distinction, though, without a difference, because I think at the end of the day, someone correct me if I'm wrong, but the goal of doing these sorts of things, manipulating Stacks assets with Bitcoin transactions, is to grow the addressable market for Stacks developers, because now you can also count native Bitcoin users as users of your smart contract, your app, et cetera, et cetera. Whether or not they install a Stacks node, it just might not be necessary in certain use cases, but it might be absolutely necessary in others. But at the end of the day, I think that one thing, for me at least, one deliverable that I'm taking away from this talk so far is kind of the thing that I'd shared with Jason the other day, which is about like steps 1, 2, and 3 right here, use cases and ideas, are really manifestations of the same thing. And that is, can there be a generic reusable way for somebody to do what's basically a contract call from Bitcoin? And the answer to that is yes, if we're willing to admit the fact that there is one extra step that happens in between, which is the Bitcoin user sends the payload to the contract call inside the Bitcoin transaction. That includes like their public key, which can be derived to a Stacks address, as well as clarity data embedded within a Bitcoin op return. Like the wallet can take care of that. That information, though, needs to get relayed into the Stacks blockchain somehow. They don't have to do that. That can be something anyone can do, but it has to get there somehow. And that relaying process is the act of realizing the change or the contract call that Bitcoin user had intended to invoke. That's kind of like where the thinking of this is like an RPC from the Bitcoin chain to the Stacks chain thinking comes from. That's all doable. Like we had the tools to do that in 2.1. We could have a SIP built that describes the supported way of doing this, and we could have reference implementation. And then from there, though, the question of whether or not the question I think for wallet developers becomes like, do they support this RPC mechanism or not? And then whether or not the user needs to run a Stacks node is kind of a question I think that's specific to the application. But that's just my take on it, Mark.
I'd like to add a little bit too, that I think of it as building blocks. If we just have the ability to attribute ownership to a Bitcoin address where someone could come back later and prove they own it, then that gives us the ability to escrow and do a transfer. If we have the ability to allow them to send and receive, they could operate as long as they like on the Bitcoin side, but I think it just slowly brings them that full. And I'll share one of my use case ideas too, is the same along the lines of these NFTs, but the idea that somebody would be participating in something like a daily auction, and when you win the NFT is governance rights to do something with the DAO. And in that case, you have people who can participate with Bitcoin. You can be unattached. You don't have to come in and claim your NFT. But when you're ready to take your next step, that's going to be setting up your Stacks wallet and coming in and being in this side of the universe. So I think those little bridges do open up a whole ton of possibility. And that's what a lot of us are looking for, is how to just create a standardized way for this to happen. So with that in mind, let's actually flip to the next slide, Hero. I'll go through this one real quick. I just wanted to give a shout out to some of the stuff that's out there already working with Bitcoin and Stacks. So, we have Xverse, which supports both wallets. We have Catamaran swaps and Magic swaps that do atomic swaps between Stacks and Bitcoin already using HTLCs. We have LN swap, which does the same thing, but also adds on some contracts that do allow for minting NFTs and sending and stacking Stacks. We have DLC Link that's coming online soon to enable things like decentralized mining pools, escrow and lending services, basically anything that an Oracle can attest to in a decentralized way. And then CBDC, if you haven't seen this, there's this idea called chain hooks that's being talked about as well. And it allows you to observe and perform actions based on events that happen on either chain. Each thing has a different level of centralization, decentralization trade-off. But these are things that are out there now. And if you haven't looked into them yet, I definitely recommend seeing if there's any overlap in what we're trying to do versus what's been figured out already. And with that in mind, let's flip to the next one. This was something that came up before, and I think would be worth talking about as well, is this idea of like storing data inside of the Bitcoin transactions, because that's what we're going to go back and read from the Stacks chain. And I do think there's room for automation on both sides. I'm watching things like how the Magic Supplier server runs and how that handles the Bitcoin wallet, how Arcadico has keepers for Stacks automation and how things can be run on that side. And with that in mind, we're going to want to pass data. And these were two scripts that were put up by Hank on the forum, just thinking through like how someone could do something to say, like, I want to send an NFT. And we got into the idea of putting SIP18 messages into these as well. So when we're looking at storing data or doing that on the Bitcoin side, one of my initial questions is, how difficult is this to do today with existing wallets? Like, is this something that has to be a custom solution?
My first approximation guess is yes, because these don't look like standard transactions. I might, in the forum post, I suggested putting this into an op return, which is like the memo field of a transaction, which most wallets do support.
That was one of my questions too. I saw his preference for op drop. I've heard op return used in other spots. I know we've talked a little bit about it too. That's the part I was most curious about. And like, as we're trying to store data on the Bitcoin side, maybe Ken, like when it comes to Xverse, doing these kind of Bitcoin transactions, is that something that if we had a standard could be integrated pretty easily with Xverse?
Yeah, I think if we have a standard, we can definitely integrate it into Xverse. But you know, then I guess the question would be, what kind of advantages do we get from this? Because any other Bitcoin wallet would not support this kind of feature, right? And I think, as Jude mentioned, if you use the op return, then some of the other wallets out there will let you put in, you know, op return data, whereas I don't think they'll let you put your own, you know, op codes and script in there by yourself, right?
Yeah, I was curious about that too. You know, the idea, I was checking out the LN swap experience, and I really liked how it would pop up a QR code and I could just scan the transaction and it would go through and happen. So I do wonder if there's a world where something like that could be used, but I don't know what wallets support too much on the Bitcoin side. I've been using all my Stacks wallets, so I'm learning a little more about what's out there and what can be done. But this idea of being able to, you know, send data is really what got me inspired to think of that idea of an escrow. You know, like if I were to airdrop a Bitcoin address, an NFT, there could be a contract that holds that NFT and knows what that Bitcoin address is. And then that user could somehow prove they own that Bitcoin address through a transaction on the Stacks side. That was one idea that I had. And it does require them coming over to Stacks to own the NFT, but maybe that's a step one. And I'm just curious too, like as we've gone through these different use cases and these ideas for everyone we have on here, is there anything more people would like to add?
Can you say that one more time, Jason? I just want to make sure I parsed it correctly. You were saying because I mean, in the way it was originally embodied, it sounded like someone who wanted to own an NFT on a Bitcoin address wouldn't ever need to come over to the Stack side until they wanted to manipulate it somehow, like sell it or transfer it or claim it or something like that. But it could still show up because the state for the NFT is just reflected in the smart contract that minted the NFT. And it's not too hard for like a website to query that state and match it against that person's Bitcoin address.
Yeah, that's exactly my thought on a step one. Like if I were to try and do something today, I know I could choose the BTC address. I could escrow it in a contract associated with the BTC address. And then the only next step that's required is for them to prove that they own it, whether that be a transaction on the Bitcoin side that's seen through Stacks, or a transaction done through Stacks that includes some information that would help verify it as well. I think probably the public key and the address, or no, that's not it.
But that's the thing, like, I don't think they have to prove that they own it at all to anyone besides themselves, because the way in which you would likely do this sort of mint, this sort of airdrop, is you would take their recipient Bitcoin address, re-encode it as a Stacks address, and then when you mint the NFT in the Stacks contract, it's just owned by that re-encoded Bitcoin address. If they wanted to claim it, like to transfer it out of the contract to themselves, or in order to sell it or to take some sort of app specific action with it, then they would need to send a Bitcoin transaction that carried out that operation. And that may or may not involve interacting with the Stacks side. At some point, if we want to make it so that they don't ever have to talk to Stacks, there would need to be someone somewhere that relays their Bitcoin transaction to the Stacks chain in order to prove that they carried out the operation. But I'm assuming that's an invisible thing to the user in this case. The user experience could just be like, oh, hey, great, you claimed your NFT, and now in the act of claiming it, you put it into a marketplace, or you put it into a gallery, or you burned it, or I don't know, you did something with it.
Yeah, I think it'd be very interesting if they could not only transfer it, but they could even do other actions like list their NFT on a marketplace with just their Bitcoin address. Eventually, they're just going to realize it's too expensive, and then they're going to want to convert to Stacks. But the idea that we say, you don't need Stacks, just do everything on Bitcoin. Here's how you do it. There's a web UI to submit the transactions, I think is would turn a lot of heads.
For sure.
So I seem to remember that we have the ability to send Bitcoin transactions that will move Stacks or stack Stacks.
That's right.
But that requires a pre-operation transaction. Is that still the case?
No. The reason that the pre-Stacks operation is required in those two use cases, because those two use cases have a very particular interpretation by the block processing logic. Namely, the act of transferring and stacking Stacks through the Bitcoin chain are transactions that cannot be ignored by miners. They have to process them. The reason we don't do arbitrary contract calls this way from Bitcoin into Stacks is because it opens up a denial of service vector. You might imagine that somebody makes an insanely expensive contract to run that takes, minutes to hours or even days to process, like just, by just, filling the whole block budget or something like that. If we made it so that miners had to honor direct contract calls this way, someone could easily prevent the blockchain from ever making progress by just recalling this expensive transaction over and over again. But the pre-Stacks operation is needed just to be able to match up the owning address to the operation in that case for the purposes of figuring out who to receive and who to send the Stacks to and from, and who to do the stacking on behalf of. If all we're doing instead is a contract call via this asynchronous method, whereby the clarity data, like the arguments to that contract call, are stored in an op return, and somebody later relays that, this whole problem goes away, because then the Stacks fee market takes care of figuring out when or even if that relayed transaction ever materializes on the Stacks side. Because that takes away this denial of service vector, we can we don't need to have this elaborate pre-Stacks transfer Stacks or pre-Stacks stack Stacks pre-Stacks contract call type operation in the first place. The operation that you try to manifest from the Bitcoin side will eventually happen, because someone will eventually be able to relay it. There might be a bit of delay if there's like network congestion, but that's just the price we're paying for adding this extra expressivity. But yeah, to answer the question, like there should be no extra step to do this. All the information we need to carry this out is contained within that single transaction in this case.
Beautiful. All right.
We've got Kurt here from OKCoin. I wonder whether Kurt has any thoughts on what we're talking about today.
I do not have any thoughts. I'm just happy to be here and hear the discussion.
Cool.
So after going through, everything we've talked about, kind of looking back, and one of my end goals here is I wanted to see, can we land on an idea that we can turn into a SIP? And I wonder, with all the discussion that's taking place now and kind of how we're looking at all our different use cases, if there's any common thread that we feel like people would like to work on.
Can I just throw a wild idea out there and see if if Jude thinks it will work?
Those are the best ideas.
Sure.
Can we like propose a upgrade to how we encode stacks addresses in the future? That's also maybe backwards compatible with the current way we do it. That is going to be convertible between a native SegWit Bitcoin address and a stacks equivalent address.
You mean like make it so a Beach32 address can be reinterpreted into like a principal that might be just a little bit longer because it has to contain more data?
Right.
I don't see why not. I think we're going to have to do that one way or another at some point. I don't think we have the time. I don't think we have the time, the person hours available to do it for 2.1, but we could probably do it for 2.2.
Right. And then in that case, would somebody be able to send a stacks asset by knowing the native SegWit address, native SegWit Bitcoin address of the recipient?
Yep.
And on the wallet side, you would just take that and convert it into the stacks equivalent and process that transaction.
Actually, I don't think you need to worry about converting the native SegWit address into a stacks address in this particular case, because either way, you can still look at, so like, let's walk through an example. Suppose that someone wanted to mint an NFT to a native SegWit address in 2.1. I think they would be able to do that because the a pay to witness pub key hash output can still be represented in Clarity, just not as a principal. You just represent it as a buffer. But that's still sufficiently powerful to let you. It's still enough information though to verify that I like the person who later consumed that UTXO and thereby proved they own that address in order to carry out some other operation. You can still check that by decoding the Bitcoin transaction because the Bitcoin transaction itself can be linked to that that SegWit output in the Clarity on the Clarity side. Like you don't need to necessarily represent the address as a principal in Clarity. I think you can get away with just using a buffer and a version number, which is essentially what goes into the Beach32 encoding anyway.
Right.
Okay, this actually could be done. Someone would have to go write the Clarity code for this. You could include the witness data as well when you relay the transaction. I wrote the original Bitcoin.Claire library that I think LNSwap folks ran with and did some awesome things with. It did not include witness data, but there's no reason why you couldn't do that. The reason you would need to do that in this particular case is because the public key and the signature are held in the witness data in a SegWit transaction script sig. The script sig itself just contains the hash of the witness, if I recall correctly. But that would still get you the properties you want, because then you could do principal love on that public key, and then that becomes their stacks address, which represents the same data that SegWit address did.
Okay, interesting.
This gets a little bit harder if you, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I think I still have to like think more about how we can make that work, but yeah, it's interesting that we can do that.
This will get a little bit harder if you try to convert something like a tap script into a stacks address. But maybe I mean, the fact that there's nothing requiring you to represent a principal on the Bitcoin side as a stacks address in order for the purposes of programmatically controlling NFTs or other stacks assets, as long as the contract is smart enough to identify the principal as data that they could only have produced. I think that might be sufficient. But I agree, we should spend some time during the testing period of 2.1 just playing around with this to see if it actually is sufficient. like having a proof of concept is a lot better than me just speculating it idly on a call on the fly.
Yeah, for sure. Would an upgrade like that break existing contracts?
By changing the address format?
By allowing, the representation of the bec32 address or the public key, and being able to recognize that as kind of like the owner.
The only breaking, so I mean, like if we went whole hog into this and made it so that there could be Stacks addresses that are just the C32 check encoding of a Beach32 output, that wouldn't change anything about the current Stacks addresses. It would just there'd just be more valid encodings of a Stacks address, kind of like how the addition of SegWit didn't invalidate the existence of legacy Bitcoin addresses. We would need a hard fork though to add support for those new types of addresses, unless we were willing to accept some other clever way of encoding it, kind of like, I don't know, hashing the Beach32 script and turning that hash into a principal, which is kind of our equivalent of SegWit P2SH. The reason it has to be this way for us and not for Bitcoin is because Bitcoin doesn't have a native notion of an address. An address is just an interpretation of a script pub key. Whereas in our system, an address is a first-class type. So adding new type, what you're basically proposing here is adding a new type, or a new variant really of the principal type. It could be done, but it would require a hard fork to do. I don't really think it would. I'm not sure what gain it would have for the purposes of this particular topic, because if it is the case that you can identify principals like by just some other identifier, like a buffer, representing that data as a principal, I'm not sure gets you anything. If it is the case though that you need to have TX sender or contract caller or something like that be equal to a principal that is a Beach32 address, then that's where things would get really tricky. We are introducing the way though in 2.1 to encode and decode principals into their constituent version and buffer types, which might alleviate that somewhat. I think that if we wanted to just definitively decide that we need to support a principal type that is one-to-one corresponds to a Beach32 address, we would need to definitively rule out any other possibility of doing this. And I'm not sure we've done that yet.
Got it. Okay.
But generally speaking, I'm not opposed to the idea. Like if people want it, then people should be able to, write a SIP for it and we can get it incorporated into the next fix, the next hard fork.
Amazing. Well, I'm going to flag that we're up to about 5 minutes left here, but I think we covered a lot of fun things, and I'm happy that we were able to get everybody together to talk about this. I do think that we're working towards some standards here that will likely become SIPs. I don't feel like they're fully defined yet, but we do know a little bit of what we want. We know a little bit of what we want the user experience to be like, and we know a little bit of what's possible today with some roadmaps to future features. So with that in mind, I just want to thank everybody again for coming out on this side of things. I'm going to leave a little room in case there are any closing thoughts from everybody presenting today, and then I'll hand things right back over to Hiro.
I might just ask that if somebody has a use case in mind that they want to build in the coming months around this, that they just flowchart it for the group and put it out on paper very concretely, then we can review it. Because I think sometimes as we're discussing these things, it's not entirely clear how all the interactions work. That would help me at the very least.
Yeah, I'm wondering if we can just sort of flowchart exactly what you just said, because it seems to me like it fits pretty well with the initial use case.
I can try to take a crack at that. I just can't, I don't have an ETA next and kind of busy heads down on 2.1 stuff.
Yeah, if you'd like, I can help you with that too. If we go over, I have most of it noted, so I could get with you async on the process, and then I'm happy to make up a flow chart. I like those things.
Yeah, Jason, you are good at the flow charts.
Thank you.
In regards to the goal here, how can we make Bitcoin and stacks feel more unified? I had to step away for a few minutes, or maybe I missed it, but the one thing I think could go a long way to achieving that is making Bitcoin transactions in chain state more readable from Clarity. Is there any work being done currently around that?
So Stacks 2.1 fixes a deficiency in 2.05, whereby in 2.05, if you want to get the hash of the Bitcoin block for a Bitcoin block that does not contain a Stacks block, there is currently no way to do that. This is fixed in the Bitcoin Clarity library that I believe it was Magic Stacks that produced, where you could supply a chain of block headers that links the that links to that links the two Bitcoin block hashes between two adjacent Stacks blocks. This lets you recover the missing block header hash and the missing block header for a Bitcoin block for which the system does not currently report the Bitcoin block hash. That's a nice stopgap measure, and it works. Like, it's working in production now. In 2.1, we're fixing this so that you'll be able to get the Bitcoin block header hash of any Bitcoin block since the Stacks blockchain started, even if it does not contain a Stacks block. Is there anything beyond that you would like? Because the reason I ask is because, like, once you have the Bitcoin block hash, the Clarity contract can supply the Bitcoin block header as well as a Merkle path to a Bitcoin transaction and a Bitcoin transaction. And then from there, programmatically verify that Bitcoin transaction is included in the Bitcoin chain, the same way an SPV wallet might do this. I'm assuming.
Yeah, offhand, there's nothing I can think of that I would like to see outside of that. But my head is thinking more about implementation versus, you know, what you just spoke about as far as retrieving hash headers, things like that.
So there would probably just be a Clarity library somewhere that's, you know, deployed as a smart contract that folks can just use, plug into.
Yeah, I guess you know, based on what you said, it's just, you know, we'll see what comes about. But my opinions may change later.
I mean, one thing that might end up happening if this gets really popular is we might just make a native Clarity function to do all the above.
Yeah, but you know, honestly, I think that's going to go a long way of achieving that goal stated here in the slide.
Cool. Okay. Anything else? Everybody happy? Yeah, okay. So thanks everybody for coming. So I'll just end with yeah, I had closing comments. Just end with, like, for those who haven't heard this before, so here is where we talk about anything SIP related, where we can further any SIP. Stacks forum is a great place where you can have these early conversations on paper first. GitHub is where you can find all the SIPs and the pull requests, the issues. So all these different places, please, yeah, feel free to jump in, participate. It's all part of the decision-making process and improving the Stack core process. So if you're interested in, like, joining CAP, consideration advisory boards, or whether it's a SIP editors, please let me know. Yeah, that's it. Thank you everybody for today. Thank you all the speakers. Thanks, Jason. Yeah, I'll give the day back to you guys.
Thanks, everybody.
Yep, thanks everyone for coming.